Jessica, thank you so much for joining me. I just wanted to, you and I have been having some conversations that I just feel like we want to maybe share with a larger audience. And so, one of the things we've been talking about recently is stress, of course, especially in general, but then during this past year, and how that affects how people function, in their teams at work, of course, personally as well, and just what we can do to help each other. And so one of the things you and I were talking about is, really what does stress look like, especially how it impacts our bodies and our ability to do our jobs and to function well in everyday life. And I know that this is a topic that's really important to you personally. And I just wanted to, get some of your thoughts and share with some folks about, what is stress, kind of, what does it look like in our bodies and the way we function, and like, why is that an important topic for you?
Okay, well, thank you for having me here. It's such a privilege, and it's just been so fun to banter back and forth with you. And yeah, stress is such a common denominator. It doesn't matter who we are, what our title is, what our background is, what our age is, we're all experiencing stress. And it's very real, and it has a huge impact on our neurochemistry and our biochemistry and what we're actually capable of. And I've had the privilege or the opportunity to do a deep dive into navigating my own stress. And I'm currently on my 4th concussion in 6 years. And my first one was very, very severe, where playing a game of Monopoly with my kids 3 months later, I couldn't understand or comprehend how to play the game. And so what happened is, my analogy is it's like walking down the street. And when you have some energy and battery life in you, you have this bandwidth. So when things come at you, you've got room to move and adapt and change. If you fall down, it's not, you've got something to lift yourself back up on. And with these head injuries, what they've done is they took away my buffer. And so my life became like walking on a tightrope. So when there was a stressor in my environment, I couldn't just muscle through it and push through it. It would shut me down. So if I had a glass of wine, the neurotoxins in the wine would make me go like this. If there was too much lighting or noise in the environment, I couldn't function. And it was immediate. It didn't have a delay. I couldn't kind of get by without it. So it was very real. And in order to get out of this, meant that I had to become my own self-advocate and do a lot of research. When I went to the concussion clinic and the brain injury clinic, they pretty much just said, go home and rest, take a few supplements, and we'll see how you do. As a result of my work in integrative nutrition and healing modalities, I at least knew enough. I didn't know the answers, but I knew there was more I could be doing. And that's where I began my work with Joe Dispenza, doing a deep dive into some of the neuroscience and the opportunities to, reprogram and rebuild your brain. And so stress became a very real topic in my life, because any slight thing would blow me off that tightrope. So I became very acutely aware of what was happening around me and what worked for me in my life and what was not working for me in my life.
So this is all like even pre the additional effects of this last year of COVID, of what it's meant for, everyone professionally, personally. So you've already been on this journey of trying to, it sounds like, identify stressors, and from a need to be able to handle those like more effectively and more efficiently and prevent them, just so they didn't like knock you completely off course. Like, you've had to really become a student of what stress looks like and what to do when it's coming at you, right? So what are some of the things that, like, what are some like manifestations of stress we might see in our bodies? And that's another thing you and I talked about that I think could be really helpful for people.
Yeah, so I call myself a professional client. I've had to be a huge experimenter to find out what works for me in order to get my way out of this. And what works for me isn't necessarily right for the next person, but it's about having this mindset of being curious and willing to try things and experiment and honor what is working for you and what's not working for you. So when we're in a stress state, um, some of the manifestations of it, when we're stressed, we have incoherence in our heart rate variability, and that influences our brain waves, and our brain waves become incoherent. And what that means is then that incoherence says we're in fight or flight, or freeze, and that there is some kind of danger. So we then trigger hormonal responses to respond to that. So our body pulls blood flow from our vital organs and sends it out into our extremities so we can go and run away from that lion. What's happening culturally, as well as with COVID, it's amplified. We're living in this chronic, we're running from a lion state. So what it's doing is we are draining our batteries, so to speak. So we can experience fatigue, brain fog, irritability. When we're in fight or flight, if this is our brain, the blood flow goes into our amygdala and is pulled back from the front of our brain into our amygdala, which means that we don't have access to our higher thinking, our memories, our creativity, our rational thinking. We don't have access to that. So when we're living in this chronic stress, we're actually not as productive or effective or creative or innovative. So the very thing we need to navigate this environment of COVID, to find our way through it and manage it, if we don't interrupt our stress patterns, is actually taking us further away from our ability to solve those problems.
Okay, so what we need so the very thing that we need to find better ways to deal with, the isolation, maybe, reduced income, unemployment. Maybe we're still working, but we have teams that aren't working well together or don't know how to solve new business problems. We have dampened creativity and innovation because we're in such constant stress. So you mentioned interrupting that stress, I think is how you put that. How does that work?
So how does that work? So what we can do, there's simple things that we can do throughout a day that will help interrupt that incoherence. So stress has a half-life. If we have a stressful response in the morning driving to work, and somebody runs a red light and it scares us, we are actually in that incoherent state for 6.5 hours later. So our cortisol's running, it's tapping into our adrenals. And it's like having a bucket of water that keeps leaking water, and we're losing energy all day long. And so by the end of the day, when we have all these stress responses, we're so tired and tapped out, and we're really fatigued. So there are things that we can do that can shift going from an incoherent to a coherent brainwave state throughout the day. So it blocks and it plugs those energy leaks so we're not so tired, and it increases our resilience and over time, our overall well-being. And so we can do that through simple things like breath. And breath is the first thing that happens to us when we come into this world, and it's the last thing that happens to us when we leave this world. And yet we have a culture that has put very little emphasis on the power of breath. And ancient traditions all have breath practices in them and embedded in them. And when we shallow breathe, that is telling our brain that we're in danger and we're in fight or flight. So the simple act of taking a deep breath and say deep breathing for 30 seconds in between calls can shift us from this incoherent brainwave state into this coherent brainwave state, which is a regenerative state. That's where we're excreting DHEA, which is the hormone that keeps us young. And if we're not in a regenerative state, we're in a cortisol state. So we're not excreting DHEA and our hair turns gray and we get wrinkles.
Wow. Okay. So, and you're just talking about breathing. We're just talking about interrupting the crazy stress stuff that's happening to us on so many different levels, enough to remind our brains that we're not actually being chased by a lion, that we're not actually in like mortal danger. Like we can relax, so we don't need all that cortisol.
It takes energy to hold stress. So think about it. Like when you're stressed, what happens in your body? We're holding tension,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when we're holding tension, that takes energy. So another technique is just to pay attention and relax into your stress and just let go. I hold it in my shoulders. So I breathe into that place and just relax, because then we're not having that tight grip unconsciously all day long, and we're exhausted by the end of the day.
That makes sense.
And so what happens over time, I have a stress meter. And if we're constantly draining our reserves, imagine like it's like our brain has the gas pedal going, but we've got the car in park. Over time, we wear down. As our energy levels, as we're feeling more depleted, as our batteries are low, stress then has more power over us. So if we're feeling low in energy and we have a stress level of 5, that stress is going to overwhelm us. If we build up our energy levels, then that level of 5 stress actually could be a catalyst for creativity and innovation and motivation to get a project done.
Okay. And that's that stress meter that you're mentioning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think maybe next we should talk about the stress meter. So thank you very much.